Hi, everyone. So today I'll be giving a talk about Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, which is celebrated in the month of May. So for today's agenda, I'll first briefly review some terms and facts, and then I will talk a little more about the AAPI group's timeline and background, as well as their impact in American culture. And then I will share with you some of my book recommendations and how I relate to this Heritage Month. So before we begin, I want to give context behind the term Asian American and Pacific Islander. So the term Asian American is coined back in 1968 by students at UC Berkeley, used as a name for their student organization. And this term unifies the political identities of people with origins from Far East, Southeast Asia, or the Indian subcontinent. And on the other hand, the term Pacific Islander includes people with origins tracing to lands of Hawaii, Guam, Samoa, or Pacific Islands. So, some interesting facts about the API community is that it's highly diverse, and members of this group trace back to more than 30 countries, each with its own unique history and culture. And currently, we have around 16.6 million members of the API community, which makes up around 5.4% of the US population, and it's still growing. And by 2050, it's projected to grow to 40 million members, which is going to be 10% of the US population. And tracing back to the mid 19th century was when Chinese and Japanese first began immigrating to the US, working as laborers on projects like the first transcontinental railroad. And it was then in the mid 20th century when refugees from Southeast Asia fled from their homelands due to war to come to the US. So this resulted in large ethnic groups, including Chinese, Filipino, Indian, Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese Americans here today, where a majority are located in the West Coast states like California, Washington, and Nevada, as well as East Coast states like New Jersey and New York, and also Hawaii. So now I'll give some context of the timeline of the API and how the Heritage Month came to be. So backtrack to the 1970s was when API played an active role in shaping policy. And there were two key factors that sparked it. First was the Black student movement, and that movement was to push for racial justice for Black Americans that initiated reforms on the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill campus, which was the college that it started in. And of course, today it has evolved into movements we now know, such as the Black Lives Matters movement. And the second was the Asian American movement, which was largely ran by young students in San Francisco who actually got inspiration from both the Black Power and the anti-war movement to do this. And during this time, there was affirmative action was growing from both the Black freedom movement and the civil rights movement as a goal to push the federal government to establish Asian Pacific American Heritage Week. And in 1977, Congress passed a resolution for early May to be dedicated to commemorating the contributions of US Americans of Pacific Asian ancestry, which later became Asian Pacific American Heritage Week. And it was then in May 1979 when Jimmy Carter declared the celebration of the nation's first API week. So, why do we choose to celebrate this in May? Um, well, actually, May marks the month of significant anniversaries of Asian American milestones and contributions in the US. The first immigrant to arrive and step foot in US soil took place in May of 1843 by a Japanese immigrant. And in May 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, and a majority of it was through the labor of Chinese immigrant workers. In the early 1990s, President George Bush proclaimed Asian Pacific American Heritage Week to be a month celebration. And this kind of suggests the growing political influence and power of Asian American and Pacific Islander groups. And then it was later on when President Obama actually changed the name to be what it is today. Um, so the API group has made some significant achievements and contributions in the past years, and this includes fighting in wars such as World War II and labor law changes for better treatment and rights in the workplace. And also, some achievements include milestones by API individuals in multiple industries such as aerospace and tech. And many Asian Americans also contributed to co-founding of notable companies we see today, such as LinkedIn, Zoom, and Yahoo. And on the other hand, there are a variety of small businesses opened up by Asian Americans. In fact, as of last year, there are more than 17,000 API business owners, and they're mostly in the sectors of food, healthcare, and retail consumer goods. We also want to recognize many API members who serve for the federal government, especially those who help push for this heritage celebration to be passed. Um, there is also a big impact of the API community made on American culture in various fields such as sports, so in basketball, and also in the media on YouTube. Well, YouTube was co-founded by Asian American, and also there's actually a large concentration of Asian American influencers nowadays. And also music and arts and cultural holidays such as Diwali and Lunar New Year, which are kind of regular U.S. holidays we celebrate nowadays, and in the film industry as well with movies such as Parasite and The Joy Luck Club, and of course the Transcontinental Railroad, back then to send goods across multiple states uh, for the Industrial Revolution, and of course the Chinatowns on like every city with delicious cuisine accompanying it. So since I mentioned some culture impact on API heritage, I also want to share a couple book recs that I personally liked related to Asian American culture. And this includes We Were Dreamers, which is a memoir that talks about the first Asian superhero's journey. A superhero meaning Marvel superhero, being a Chinese immigrant and facing cultural stereotypes during adolescence and identity growing up, and how it led to him breaking kind of the typical Asian stereotype to eventually pursue his dreams of becoming a movie star and landing his debut role for Marvel. And next is another memoir called Crying in H Mart, and it's about a half Korean American struggles with family relationship and how she kind of connects it with the foods down the aisles of H Mart. Um, and I also had to give this one a shout out because I got a signed copy from the author at an event. And because I'm biased, I also want to share Clara and the Sun, which I read. It's not necessarily about Asian culture, but it's written by a Japanese British novelist, and it was a neat dystopian psychological horror sci-fi novel that I read through a book club actually with some of the interns that we had last summer. So you guys might be wondering why I decided to give this talk. Well, it turns out I am Asian American with an ancestral descent of Taiwanese. My parents are both from Taiwan and immigrated to America in the late 90s, having me and my twin sister, which makes me a first generation Asian American. Being able to stay here in hopes for better education and opportunities was a huge privilege for me, but it was not easy as there were certain struggles and hurdles along the way. Yeah, I remember back in first grade, I almost got held back because my English fluency, especially in like reading and comprehension, wasn't on par with my classmates. And, little hurdles and struggles like these are important to look back on during this month to celebrate the milestones that have got me to where I am today, which is here. And as an Asian American, I like to relate with other members of the API community and, encourage folks to celebrate and recognize the contributions and achievements of their API peers during this month. So with that being said, these monthly celebrations help remind us to take a step back and remember the origins and history of our heritage, and commemorate the API members who built the blueprints for our traces in America. And last but not least, share stories and recognize not only our own achievements, but others' achievements and contributions as well, and celebrate it together, of course. Um, so thank you so much for listening to my talk on API Heritage Month. And if you pay close attention, you'd see that some of my slides had attractions of API countries as a fun way to take you around those areas.